New York City glittered like a diamond caught between dark fingers. The Marshall family had spent decades crafting their empire, a dynasty soaked in money, tradition, and ruthless expectation. They ruled the city from their glass tower, a monolith of power built on boardroom wars and bloodless victories. Daniel Marshall, heir to the throne, had been groomed for greatness since the day he first gripped a golden rattle. With his chiseled jaw, piercing green eyes, and the quiet confidence of someone who had never heard the word no, Daniel was destined to marry the perfect woman, a debutante from the right lineage, a flawless face for the endless gala nights and magazine covers. Everything was in its place. Everything was on schedule. Until her. She wasn't supposed to matter. She wasn't supposed to even be visible. Yet somehow, Emily Hayes, the unremarkable manager hired to smooth out the operations of Marshall Enterprises, had become the center of a storm no one saw coming. The whispers started first. The glances in the hallway. The lingering conversations. Emily, with her simple brown hair always pulled back, her plain blouses and sensible flats, didn't fit into the Marshall world. She wasn't stunning. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't anyone. And yet Daniel looked at her like she was the only thing in the room. It was unacceptable. The tension within the Marshall penthouse grew thick, unspoken but omnipresent. Friends and enemies alike waited, breathless, to see which way the winds would blow. Because when love and money collide, somebody always bleeds. It started with a meeting about supply chain issues, mundane, routine, nothing that should have made Daniel Marshall's blood sing. Emily stood at the head of the conference room, a laptop open, a projector humming softly behind her. She wasn't wearing anything special, just a simple navy blazer and a skirt, but Daniel couldn't look away. She spoke clearly, her words crisp, her ideas smarter and sharper than anyone else in the room. It was the kind of brilliance you couldn't buy, polish, or fake. Daniel leaned back in his chair, pretending casual indifference. But inside, a dangerous spark had been struck. After the meeting, he found himself lingering. "Good work, Emily," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She looked up at him, her brown eyes steady. "Just doing my job, Mr. Marshall." "Daniel," he corrected her, a smile tugging at his mouth. "Call me Daniel." That smile was the beginning of the end. From that day, Daniel found excuses to see her. Quick check-ins turned into late-night strategy sessions. Coffee meetings blurred into dinner conversations. She challenged him. She questioned him. She made him laugh in a way no debutante ever could. And she was dangerous. Because Daniel's father, Charles Marshall, noticed everything. One evening, after a gala filled with champagne and hollow smiles, Charles summoned Daniel into his private study. The walls lined with leather-bound books and the heavy oak desk between them felt more like a courtroom than a room in their home. "You're embarrassing yourself," Charles said bluntly, swirling whiskey in a crystal glass. "And worse, you're embarrassing this family." Daniel stiffened. "Emily's brilliant. She has vision. She's a manager," Charles snapped, cutting him off. "A paid employee. You don't love her. You're just bored." Daniel's jaw clenched. "You don't get to tell me who I'm allowed to care about." "Care about?" His father chuckled darkly. "You're a Marshall, you don't marry for love, you marry for legacy." Something inside Daniel cracked. "Then maybe," Daniel said quietly, dangerously, "I don't want to be a Marshall anymore." Charles set his glass down with a heavy thud, his eyes cold and calculating. "You'll regret that, boy." But Daniel was already turning away, his heart pounding with rage and resolve. He would choose Emily. Even if it meant burning everything else to the ground. Emily tried to ignore it, the flutter that started every time Daniel looked at her too long or smiled in that way that was just for her. It was stupid, reckless, impossible. She had a job to do and he had a life mapped out in marble and gold. She wasn't part of his future and she knew it. Still sometimes late at night when she stayed behind to finish reports and he would show up with coffee and that infuriating easy charm, she caught herself wishing for something more. She hated herself a little for it. She knew Charles Marshall hated her, knew he would never allow someone like her to stain the perfect Marshall bloodline. It wasn't just anger she saw in the father's cold eyes when they crossed paths, it was something closer to disdain. Daniel felt it too. He started showing up more often, ignoring schedules, skipping dinners with carefully selected heiresses. Emily begged him silently not to be obvious, but Daniel never was good at hiding what he felt once he decided he wanted something. One night after a long day of meetings, Daniel leaned on her office doorframe, casual, too casual, his tie loose, his hair mussed from running his hand through it a dozen times. "Get out of town with me," he said. She blinked, her heart lurching. "What?" she whispered. "Just for a weekend," he said, "clear your head, clear mine." Emily laughed, but it was shaky. "Your father would love that." "Let him," Daniel said, his voice dropping low, rough. "I don't care anymore." That was the night it really started. They didn't leave immediately, not yet, they weren't ready, but the plan was born between them in that small quiet office under the flickering fluorescent lights while the rest of the world slept. And deep down Emily knew she was already lost. Even if it destroyed them both. The plan grew in whispered conversations and secret text messages. Daniel and Emily began to build a future no one else could see. It started with scouting other cities, ones where the Marshall name carried less weight. Daniel suggested Chicago, but Emily hesitated. Finally they chose Boston. It was close enough to New York to stay connected but far enough to be free. They spent late nights huddled over laptops drawing up business plans, creating something leaner, faster, sharper than the lumbering Marshall empire. Daniel's contacts were strong. He had friends, allies, people tired of Charles Marshall's iron fist. It wasn't hard to find them, quiet men and women who had talent but no loyalty to a king who saw them as disposable. Emily was careful, cautious. She whispered the idea to a few she trusted, and soon enough whispers turned to promises. By day they smiled, played the roles expected of them. By night they built an army. Charles noticed Daniel growing distant. His rage simmered. He summoned his son again, threatening him, warning him, reminding him of everything he stood to lose, but Daniel only smiled, a sharp, cold smile that sent a chill through the old man's veins. It was happening. They were building something new. And nothing could stop them now. Charles Marshall was not a man who watched quietly while his empire cracked. He started pulling strings, powerful strings. He blocked accounts, fired anyone he suspected of disloyalty, tightened his grip on the company like a man trying to choke the life out of a rival. He hired investigators to dig up dirt on Emily, fabricated rumors, whispered poison into the ears of Daniel's old friends, trying to isolate him, cut him down before he could rise. Daniel expected the war, but Emily felt the weight of it differently. Each whisper, each cold stare from former colleagues tightened a knot of fear in her chest. She could see the cost in every email that went unanswered, every meeting suddenly rescheduled. Still they pushed forward, driven by something too fierce to kill. Until the phone call that shattered her. It came on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of gray, bleak day where the city felt like it was drowning. Emily answered her phone, distracted, already thinking about meetings and documents and everything they had to do, but the voice on the other end was tight, unfamiliar. "Miss Hayes, I'm sorry to inform you your mother suffered a cardiac arrest. She didn't make it." The world dropped away in a rush of static. Emily sat frozen, hearing the words but not believing them, not feeling them, not at first. When Daniel found her, she was still sitting at her desk staring at nothing. "Emily," he said, his voice breaking at the edges. She blinked up at him, dazed. "My mother, Daniel, my mother." He pulled her into his arms, held her as she shook, and for the first time their escape plan had begun. Emily felt doubt, not about Daniel, not about love, but about the timing, the cruelty of it all. They were fighting a war, building a dream, but life didn't wait for dreams to come true. Life smashed through everything without mercy. Daniel didn't say anything wise or comforting, he just held her until her breathing steadied, until the world felt real again, even if it was a little darker now. Outside the rain kept falling, relentless and cold. It was a betrayal that hit like a blade between the ribs. Daniel trusted too easily, too fast, and now they were paying the price. Someone from the inner circle, someone he called a friend, had leaked everything to Charles. Their business plan, their investors, their timeline, all laid bare before the man who hated them most. The first blow came when their key supplier suddenly backed out, no explanation, just a cold email late at night. Emily stared at the screen, her heart pounding. "It's him," she said, voice shaking. "It's your father." Daniel already knew, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw set hard enough to crack. Then came the second blow. Their newly rented office space suddenly lost due to unforeseen zoning issues, a flimsy excuse that stank of influence and fear. Emily tried to stay strong, but the grief for her mother still clung to her like smoke. Sometimes she found herself staring into space, feeling utterly hollow. And Daniel, he was changing too, becoming sharper, colder, more dangerous. One night, after yet another setback, Daniel came home, threw a folder onto the kitchen table. "It's Carter," he said flatly, naming the man who had been his friend since prep school. "He sold us out for a seat back at my father's table." Emily sat down slowly, the weight of it all crushing her chest. "What are we going to do?" Daniel leaned over the table, eyes burning. "We're going to burn the table down." But Emily wasn't so sure anymore. The grief, the betrayal, the fear, it all twisted inside her, and for the first time she wondered if they were strong enough to survive the fire they had started. And somewhere high above the city skyline, Charles Marshall raised a glass and smiled, because he knew this war was far from over. Emily couldn't breathe anymore. New York, that had once felt alive, now pressed down on her like a tomb. The betrayal, the war, the endless pressure, and most of all the hole her mother's death had ripped through her chest. She tried to keep moving, tried to keep fighting beside Daniel, but every day the world felt heavier, and Daniel, he was different now, harder, more ruthless. She saw the way he stared out the windows at night, as if the city itself was an enemy he had to crush. One night she packed a single bag, no hesitation, no long letter goodbye, just a scrap of paper tucked under his favorite book. "I can't stay, I'm sorry." Daniel found the note hours later, after storming back from another failed investor meeting. He read it once, twice, then crumpled it in his fist. His roar of rage and grief rattled the windows. But Emily was already gone. She booked the earliest flight out of JFK, clutching her passport like a lifeline, her hands shaking so hard the airline clerk had to repeat herself twice. She chose Paris not because it was a dream, but because it was far, because it was quiet, because no one knew her name there. On the flight she stared blankly at the clouds, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life or saved herself from drowning. Somewhere over the Atlantic she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for Daniel, for the boy she had loved and left behind. And in a silent penthouse high above the city, Daniel Marshall poured himself a drink and stared at the door she would never walk through again. Daniel didn't chase her. For months he didn't even try. He buried himself in the ruins of what they had built, turning cold, ruthless, unstoppable. Marshall, blood running through him harder than ever before. The new company limped at first, then crawled, then sprinted. Daniel crushed deals, bullied rivals, bought loyalty, and when people whispered that he had become a monster, he didn't argue, because monsters survive. But success tasted like ash. Every night he looked at the door and knew she wasn't coming back. Meanwhile in Paris, Emily didn't heal the way she thought she would. She worked small jobs, taught business classes to bored students, stared at empty streets, wondering why running had felt like saving herself but living felt like dying. One evening almost a year later she sat in a cheap cafe, rain streaking the windows, when a man slipped into the chair across from her. He wasn't Daniel, but the sight of him made her heart pound, because he carried a message. "He said you would never forgive him," the man said, sliding a battered envelope across the table, "but he wanted you to have this anyway." Inside was no letter, no apology, just a simple piece of paper. A deed. Ownership papers for the company they had built together. Signed over to her completely. He had given it all to her. Emily stared at it for a long time, her hands trembling. She could have cried, could have laughed, but instead she felt something break free inside her, something she hadn't realized had been chained all along. Without a word she stood, walked out into the rain, and let the water wash everything else away. Daniel Marshall stayed in New York, a king without a queen, a man who won the world and lost himself. Emily Hayes stayed in Paris, a woman who lost her heart but found her soul. And sometimes, when the rain fell just right, they both smiled without knowing why. Charles Marshall had not been idle while his son built something new. He watched and waited, gathering power the way a spider waits in the center of its web, patient and merciless. Daniel's company was strong, but it wasn't untouchable, not against the full weight of Marshall Enterprises. Charles whispered to old friends in high places, reminded them of old favors long owed, money moved under tables, lawyers made quiet threats, partnerships evaporated without warning. Contracts once thought ironclad dissolved overnight, banks tightened their credit lines, suppliers lost shipments mysteriously, customers withdrew for strategic reasons. At first Daniel refused to believe it, then he tried to fight, but it was like wrestling a shadow. Every time he blocked one attack, two more slipped through. His staff grew restless, some left fearing the collapse, others stayed out of loyalty, but loyalty didn't pay salaries. Investors pulled out, rumors flooded the industry. Daniel Marshall, they said, brilliant but reckless, too emotional, too compromised to lead. And all the while Charles smiled, sipping aged scotch in the corner office that once overlooked Daniel's every step. By the time Daniel realized he was losing, it was already over. He sat alone in the ruins of what he'd built, the walls around him crumbling, contracts scattered across the floor like dead leaves. The king had fallen, and the only one laughing was the man who wore his blood. The offer came not with fanfare but with a single envelope delivered by hand late one rainy night. Inside it was simple, a short letter typed in crisp, cold words. "Come home, we have a place for you." Daniel stared at it for a long time, the paper blurred through the haze of whiskey and shame. He told himself he wouldn't go, he told himself he would rebuild from the ground up again, but deep down he knew the truth. He was broken. He walked into Marshall Enterprises 3 days later, not as a conqueror, not as a son claiming his birthright, but as a defeated soldier returning to the very king who had crushed him. Charles waited in his vast office, a smirk barely concealed behind a mask of civility. "Welcome back, son," he said, voice smooth as poison. "We always knew you'd come to your senses." Daniel said nothing. He signed the contracts. Assistant vice president, meaningless title, no real power, no real respect, just a place at the table where he would be reminded every day of what he had lost. Charles made sure of it. Every meeting, every document, every memo was a chain around Daniel's neck, a reminder that the price of rebellion was not death, it was humiliation. Daniel wore his suit like armor, but inside something rotted. Charles had won the battle, had broken his will, had reclaimed his heir. But deep within Daniel Marshall's hollow chest something else stirred, something patient, something dangerous, something that looked very much like hate. The suit grew heavier every day, the walls of Marshall Enterprises tighter, colder, more suffocating. Daniel dragged himself through meetings that felt like funerals, smiled at backstabbers, shook hands with men who whispered about him the moment he turned away. He thought the shame would numb him eventually, but it didn't. It festered, it burned, until one night it finally exploded. He waited until late after the offices were dark, silent. He walked into the executive wing, into the vault where Charles Marshall kept his emergency funds, a private slush fund hidden from even the board. Daniel knew the codes, he knew everything his father thought he had forgotten. He emptied it all, millions, not a penny left for Charles to gloat over. He left a simple handwritten note atop the empty safe. "I hate you." By the time Charles discovered the betrayal, Daniel was already gone. He fled the country with one of the few loyal friends he had left, a partner who had risked everything alongside him. They landed in Buenos Aires with nothing but stolen money and a second chance. No empire, no skyscrapers, just simple work, real work. They bartended, painted houses, taught English to tourists, anything that earned them enough to live. And somehow in that stripped-down life Daniel found dignity again. He met a woman, a local artist, with paint on her hands and fire in her heart. They married barefoot on a beach with no witnesses, no fanfare, just a promise whispered against the ocean wind. He was no longer a Marshall in the way his father had meant. He was something better.